right, and you're live on YouTube. You may go ahead.
Okay. At this time, I will call the meeting of the Library of Virginia's Public Library Development Committee meeting to order. And I just want to start off by welcoming everybody. This is, as far as I know, this is the first time we've had a virtual committee meeting, at least in the 4 years I've been on the board. So, and it's been an interesting year, to say the least. And I want to thank you all for coming out today, because there are some things that I've always wanted the committee to look at, and we just haven't had the opportunity in the last 14 months. And so I wanted to start off today by talking, you have an agenda of 3 items. I'm actually going to flip 1 and 2. I want to start first with the approval of updating the Planning for Library of Excellence. Oops, let me, my phone was ringing. I want to talk about that, and because that'll be a shorter run, and also because I think once we finish that, you'll find that it kind of leads into the reconsideration of the state aid formula, which I wanted to discuss primarily. So I want to first turn it over to Nan to give us kind of an overview of, and hopefully you've all had a chance to read the updates to the PLE. And then if you could give us an overview of the changes and what we're looking at regarding the equity portion of it, which has changed from 2019.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, everybody, for taking time for us today. So as you all know, beg your pardon, last spring we brought to you the 2 springs ago, we brought you the 2019 Planning for Library Excellence revision. And it had been 10 years since the document had been revised. And a robust working committee worked on that for a year, and felt that we had made some really good improvements in the understandability and language, as well as the usage of the document. And we're very pleased with that. And after the next 12 months or so, we realized we'd missed an opportunity to address equity, diversity, and inclusion in that document. And so we took a smaller working group that included representatives from various libraries in various regions, as well as consulted with the Virginia Library Association's Librarians of Color Forum chair and co-chair, as well as our various assistive services librarians across the Commonwealth who'd already been doing a lot of the accessibility and inclusion work for our communities who might have mobility, vision, or hearing challenges to using the library. So in that working group, we just got down to it and started drafting some language, having it reviewed by various parties. Certainly the addition of the Library of Virginia's language guide helped us tremendously in unifying some of the language surrounding how we talk about different kinds of people in our communities. And so the draft that you have before you now was approved in April by the library director community at the Virginia Public Library Director Association meeting. And that brings it to you to discuss and hopefully endorse the language that's presented there to set a standard for making sure that all people are welcome in Virginia's public libraries. So that's really the additions that were made. We're including all kinds of people that we already encounter in libraries, but just hoping to set that bar so that libraries are keeping accessibility for all at the top of their mind.
Okay. So the way I like to handle questions, debate, and motions is that to have those on the committee have any questions of Nan or the staff, to ask those questions up front, and then make a motion to approve or not approve, whatever the motion may be, have it seconded, and then have the discussion within the motion so that we can then just vote on what we want to do. So to that end, I'm going to open it up to the committee for any questions you may have of Nan regarding your reading or interpretation, or general questions about the updates. If you just raise your hand, or just jump in. Marcy or Laura, go ahead.
Nan, On page 6, I think, of the guide, up at the top, there's the first sentence. And I had to read this a few times, so forgive me. When it talks about libraries could quickly determine whether they meet basic standard, but to use PLE correctly, they needed to analyze progress towards essential aspiring and Excel guidelines, depending on the planning profile of their library. And I was wondering if there has been any talk about that particular sentence, making essential aspiring and Excel guidelines be those 3 E's of essential, enhanced, and exemplary guidelines. Or am I reading that sentence wrong as to what it means?
You are not at all, but I can see why that's confusing. The first iteration used those words that are now no longer in the document. So, so it makes sense that, having not ever seen this before, that you thought, what in the world are they talking about? So the 2004 edition, or excuse me, the 2010 edition had those as the levels: the essential, the aspiring, and the excelling guidelines. So we can certainly figure out how to make that more understandable for those who don't have that context.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
And she's referring to the essential, enhanced, and exemplary, or some other 3 E's? Because under ratings, you got 3 E's.
Right.
And then up earlier, there's another, well, they're not E's, the E's
Right.
and rationale, equity. So are you referring to those 3 E's?
I think what she's referring to is the fact that the original document of it used A ratings like bonds. There was single
Okay.
A, essential, double A, which was aspiring, and triple A, which was excelling. And that's the rating system that's being referred to in that paragraph, that now makes no sense because it's not referred to in the rest of the document. So I can change that just by taking those words out and discussing the fact that the previous guidelines, that they need to analyze progress towards the, maybe I can say like the 2006 guidelines, depending on the planning profile of their library.
Okay. Are any other questions or elaboration on the questions that have been asked? Marcy, Maya? Seeing none, I'm going to move that the committee approves the Planning for Library Excellence document changes, as will be amended further by Nan. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Seconded by Shelley Murphy. I will open up discussion. I just want to say that the equity has been a dicey word lately, and one of the things I was concerned about is, would equity talk about hiring practices for libraries? And this document is very broad in the use of equity and inclusion, and it does not touch on that. It's touching on equity of using the library and how we get out to the population as a whole. And we're not necessarily talking about equity in the hiring realm, which, given the variety of geographic differences throughout Virginia and the 90-odd library systems, would be quite difficult to maintain. Outside of that, I think what we will see in this document, it will lead us into the conversation we're going to have about state aid, where there also is an equity challenge, not based on any particular demographic, but based on money, on income of community and library systems. So so I'm happy to support the changes and recommend that the full board do so as well. Any other discussion or comments?
I will comment that there's HR practices that we do address, and that's mostly in the recruitment, certainly fairness in policy, et cetera. But you're correct, there are no quotas or requirements for hiring any type of person, just the practices in which you do your hiring.
Right, exactly.
And the whole thing will get a fine tooth comb from our communications manager. I realize that there's probably some spacing and punctuation issues, but whenever you have a working document like this, it gets a little messy until it gets approved. So
Any
I'm
other-
curious,
Marcy?
during the discussion at the Public Library Directors Association meeting, was there any discussion? I mean, was there concerns raised by the library directors over the document? I know that I heard you say that they approved it, so but I'm curious about.
they were unanimous in regards to this EDI language. There were some additional thoughts and ideas surrounding the entirety of the document, which from my perspective, this is a living document and that we can continue to make it better as we have the opportunities. And the two issues that were brought up had nothing to do with the equity and diversity inclusion aspect. And so we tabled those to create a committee to look at those particular items further. And I think if I remember correctly, they surrounded oh, Marcy, forgive me. I have forgotten exactly what they were. Since it wasn't relevant to this conversation, I didn't bring it to the top
Yeah,
of my mind.
that's okay. Yeah, just
But in
curious.
terms of EDI language, they were unanimously supportive of that.
Thank you.
Any other discussion? Anyone? Seeing none, all those in favor of adopting the changes signify by saying aye.
I
Aye.
Any opposed? Seeing none, the motion will carry 5-0 with 2 absent, Mr. Elsami and Mr. Bryant. Thank you, guys. We will now move on to what I believe kind of dovetail into the big reason that I wanted the committee to be able to meet was to discuss the state aid formula. As many of you may, for those who've been around with me for a while, have known that I have long harped on the General Assembly's treatment of state aid and the balance of how state aid, what we do get, works. I believe we're at approximately 60% of fully funded state aid, and I think it's 11 million short or 10 million short, depending on how we account for that 1 million that was just brought in. And it always reminded me of in the equity world, there's a little cartoon you guys may have seen. It's 3 boys standing at a fence, trying to look over the fence to see a baseball game. And they're 3 different sized kids. One's 6 feet tall, 5 feet tall, and 4 feet tall. And the tallest kid can see over the fence. The middle kid can sort of see to the edge of the fence, and the little kid is way in the bottom. And so it was an example of equality versus equity. So they gave all 3 kids a 2-foot-high stool. So the tall kid had no problem. It was equal in the size of the stools, but the little kid's stool, even though it was the same size stool as the other kids, still couldn't see over the fence. So while their stools were all equal, they weren't equitable. Then the next picture they show what equity looks like. The tall kid has no stool. The middle kid has a medium-sized stool, and the little kid has a step ladder that gets them up to a stool so that all their heads are the same height above looking over the fence. And that was a fine example of equity versus equality. And I see that with our state aid because we still have a fence, and that fence is the fact that 40% of state aid is not funded. We have different size library systems that rely on state aid in different ways that the equity nature of it, and I always go back to my Loudoun County roots in the library world. Loudoun County gets approximately $250,000 a year in state aid under the current formula and then funding amounts. To be perfectly honest, I'm one of the few quasi-government officials that will say we could get by without the money. Loudoun County's budget surplus because of pandemic and closures this year will amount to somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 million. We can survive. But the way the state aid formula is structured, if Loudoun County were to say, we don't need our state aid this year. Have an equitable distribution of that funds throughout the system. That can't happen. The way the state aid formula works now is the money just stays in the pot and gets divided up amongst the remaining 90 odd library systems. And that prevents someone like, pick a very, Russell County, pick a very small library system or very small regional library system, that portion of Loudoun County's funding, say they got $50,000 of it, could be another staffer that could really help implement the equity pieces we're talking about in the Planning for Library Excellence document. They may not have the ability to get beyond one-star library status simply because they don't have the staffing to put in place the tools necessary to do those things. So as I further looked at the whole issue of state aid, look, if we had $27 million and everything was fully funded, great, but we don't. We're at 60%. How can we get the smaller libraries that might need to get to 100% a whole lot sooner than the larger systems like Loudoun that don't? And the biggest impediment to that is the structure that we have in the state aid formula. We can't deviate from that. Only the General Assembly can. One thing we can do is ask the General Assembly to take a look at state aid, and are there ways that until we're at full funding, we can divvy up the money a little bit more equitably so that smaller library systems that are in more dire need of funding can get closer to 100% before the Loudons and the Prince Williams and the Fairfaxes of the world have greater resources, get to their 60% mark. In other words, if Loudoun was only getting 40%, but Russell County was able to get 80%, that's a more equitable distribution in some regard of state aid funding. But in order to get the state to even consider looking at that, they first need to conduct a JLARC study, Joint Legislative Audit Review Committee, which is a combined House of Delegates and Senate committee that researches all of these issues. The last time we had a JLARC study for state aid was 2001, I believe, Sandy. I think it was 2001. It was studied in 2000, came out in 2001. And remarkably, the data in that report, which I somehow managed to read, the data in that report was based on the 1990 census. We hadn't quite gotten to the numbers from the 2000 census in order to evaluate the state aid formula at the time. And I remarked that Loudoun County's population in the last JLARC study was like 180,000 people. It's 2.5 times the size. We're going to find out later this year. So, and there's many counties that are like that. The population of Virginia is up about 800,000 people since 2020. Since 2000, I mean. So we've seen an increase in population. We've seen a consolidation of population in more urban areas. And I've also noted that in Virginia, this is an interesting fact, there are more jurisdictions, there are more magisterial jurisdictions in Virginia that have fewer than 10,000 people than have more than 100,000 people. So most of Virginia, and you expand to 20,000 population, most of Virginia is 20, 30,000 population municipalities and smaller. There's only one above 500,000, that's Fairfax, and there's only 3 in the 400,000 range. So Virginia is made up of a lot of these small places that might benefit more from a different distribution of state aid until such a time as state aid is fully funded. And perhaps this JLARC study, if we approve it here through the committee, the request, and get the state to actually do it, perhaps we come with a whole new formula that that says maybe we are doing it wrong. And it's also possible through this study, it's been 20 years, they may look at it and say, all the things that we considered 20 years ago are still relevant today. They didn't make sense 20 years ago. They didn't make sense today. And yes, this is the best way for us as a state to administer state aid. And that could be the solution also. I would rather it not be, but that could be what comes out of this. So, but that being said, it's been 20 years. And the state does this. They like to look at these things. And if we can find the right person, the right time, the right place to carry the water for that study, and it can be produced in the next 18 months to 2 years. I mean, none of what we're talking about today will be implemented possibly while any of us are still on the board. Maybe some of us early in our first term might be around to see this implemented in their second term on the board. But if we don't start now, 5, 8, 10 years from now, we'll just be that much further behind then. So that is the general rationale for me wanting to bring the committee together. But that being said, there are some other intricacies of state aid that might come into play in your decision about how we proceed. And I know Kim is without a doubt the expert in state aid and the formula. And if Kim, you would like to comment on anything I have said, feel free to tell me I'm crazy and wrong. Feel free to tell me something makes sense, and feel free to add your own experience and history with state aid to the conversation.
Oh, thanks, Mark. I was always a little bit curious about full funding. We've kind of taken it for granted that full funding would solve a lot of problems. So I went back and looked in the spreadsheet and ran some calculations. And what I found is full funding is not full funding because only one of the elements is capped. As numbers continue to grow, population in particular, that number will continue to climb as it has over the years. So currently right now we're at about 27.5 for full funding. That's up since 10 years ago, and it will be up in another 5 years as budgets continue to increase, populations continue to grow. The only thing that might stay static is the square miles. And right now there is a trend to de-regionalize. But if that were to reverse and localities decided to enter into regional contracts again, those additional incentives for regional libraries that are built into the state aid formula would start to draw the allocations away even more towards these regional entities. So that was just something interesting that I found as I went back and reviewed the spreadsheet. So I thought I'd better throw that out there, that full funding in itself is not a solution, and that we have to really make sure that we understand all of the working parts of the formula.
Marcy.
Kim, could you remind me of the segments of the formula? I know it's land area, per capita, I mean, population, it's local support, right?
It is. So it's three elements. It's 40% of local support, and that does get capped at 250,000. So for instance, if your locality has given you money and you've expended up to about 625,000, that's when the cap gets put into place. And as of, I guess this past fall, we had about 46 jurisdictions that were capped. A lot of them are the cities, Marcy. And then several of the regionals had capped localities within their library systems. So that's up from the JLARC study. So more libraries are capped now. The other, of course, is the population, and the formula says that for the first 600,000 people served, it's 30 cents per person. And then anyone or any locality over 600,000 receives 10 cents for the remaining population. And as we know, I think Fairfax is the only one that's impacted by that additional money. So population is not capped. There is a speed bump in it, but it's not capped. And then finally, the third component of the formula is the square miles. Libraries get $10 per square mile. And then of course, there are the regional incentives that add an additional $20 per square mile, as well as 10 cents per capita in the population.
So I'm wondering if if you're local contribution, which the richer libraries obviously have more local contribution, and that's capped.
Mhm.
And the excess population above 500,000 is at a lesser amount than the first 500,000, 30 cents versus 10. Don't we have kind of those checks and balances in place to provide the equity, Mark, that you want, that we all want?
Well, and so I don't disagree with that statement, but it's also possible, yeah, a 600,000 cap for population with the speed bump. Maybe it makes sense that because of the disparity because of the few number of jurisdictions that are even approaching that number. What if that the 30 cents, 10 cents was not at 600,000, but it was at 200,000?
Mhm.
Would then it start to find ways to funnel more money sooner to smaller jurisdictions that need it before we get to the full? And I know the full funding we never achieve it, but 27.5 million right now, we're at 17 million. So there's still room for $10 million of the state to spend money. But what can we do in the interim until the state spends more money? That's what I'm saying, is how do we get Russell County closer to 100%? Because right now everyone's even when you account for caps, everyone's kind of getting about their percentage. Because of caps, there's a few points here and there, but few jurisdictions are getting 90% while others are getting 40%. Most of the jurisdictions are kind of right in a relative in an equal percentage rather than an equitable percentage of state aid. And it just seems to me that maybe there is another way to look at it. And the only way to do that is through a JLARC study. It's the only way we can we can say, hey, would you look at this, that, or the other thing? At the end of the day, the JLARC committee is going to look at it however they choose to look at it. But I guess that's the thing. Are there ways to adjust the state aid formula that would further further equitably distribute the money until we have even more? And like I said, perhaps doing the study would just convince the state, hey, wait a second, maybe we should be putting $10 million more a year into state aid. Because then maybe a lot of these General Assembly members, the vast majority of which were not around 20 years ago, the vast majority of which have never seen a state aid JLARC study done, that maybe they could look at it and say, wait a second, my community is missing out. So I do like this idea. I guess that's where I know I'm being a little long-winded now. That's, I guess, my rationale for looking at it is, can things like the population number be lowered to spread out the money sooner so that smaller places can get it and bigger places can maybe get by with a little less until we can fund them further?
I think I kind of disagree with your major premise that just because you're big, you don't need the money. It's, I mean, you're serving more people. Presumably you're more diverse. You've got, depending on the land area, I mean, it may be easier to provide library services in Russell County than Virginia Beach, let's say, because you've got fewer people to kind of determine the needs for. I'm not sure. I'm speaking without any kind of basis there, but I mean, it seems like the things that the Library of Virginia is doing for everyone in the state, which is increasing the availability of broadband, increasing access to electronic resources for everyone, that those are the things that provide the equity that we need for smaller places versus larger places. I'm not opposed to looking at a formula that's 20 years old, but I think my end result would be my desired end result would not be the same one as you have, but I wouldn't be adverse to studying the formula. Kim, what do you think? I mean, is the formula working from your perspective?
From my perspective, it is. As you pointed out, there are already caps in place that temper the amount of money that the larger systems are getting in order to enable the smaller systems to receive a bigger portion of the state aid allocations. I believe you were involved a lot with the JLARC study last go around. I know I was around, Sandy was around, to hear all of the discussions that happened among the library directors themselves. And they were very passionate about doing no harm, that the formula should never penalize anybody. And that means big systems as well as small systems. I think another consideration is that if a large system decides that it is being penalized by the formula, they will go out and have legislation enacted in order to get more money through a different circuit. And we've seen that happen with Fairfax. Just because their population was so large, they were able to argue that they receive an additional allocation. So it's always a little bit of a concern when you throw it out that far, what the implications might be. And if people aren't happy with the decisions that are made with the formula, they may just go a different way.
So
has shared from the small group, sort of focus group that Mark and I assembled. We sent you the notes from. I think everybody feels pretty okay with the current formula, but like Marcy said, the formula is 20 years old. You know, and it never hurts to take that look. And one of the larger system directors did point out that larger systems capital costs are often greater because their buildings take more wear and tear. So, you know, the formula as it stands is serving our libraries. But the formula as it stands is 20 years old, and we're in a much different place than we were 20 years ago. So I can't argue with taking another look. And somebody with a brain larger than mine might find some new way to innovate. I do share Kim's concern about opening the can of worms, and having a locality that has some political power to say, well, if they're going to do that, we're going to do this. We know how, you know, as much as we don't like the fact that libraries are political, they are. That they're just to avoid any tit for tat sort of backlash.
Mm-hmm.
I will also say that in that small group that Nan and I had with some directors, some of the smaller directors from the smaller libraries were like, yeah, $35,000 would go a long way for helping us do this, that, and the other thing. And the directors from some of the larger libraries are like, yeah, well, that $35,000 for you is potentially $185,000 for us. And gee, that's, you know, 2 branch managers, you know, so they do look at it similarly. This is my political bent, is that larger jurisdictions that have more healthy funding really need to take a harder look at how they fund libraries. And that's just me being what I've done, advocating for libraries for, you know, a decade now at the local, state, and national level. You know, I always marvel that every time in Loudoun County we go and approve a new data center, one of the arguments for approving that data center is that it will generate more tax revenue in a year than we spend on our library system. Every time we approve a new data center. So we've added, you know, a dozen different centers that each of them generates more than the $22 million a year that we spend on our libraries, yet we only spend, and it's, you know, you're fighting for a nickel and a dime. And, you know, one of the things I hope is that through doing this study, maybe we get to the point where some more financially robust jurisdictions put a finer point and more of a priority on local funding for libraries. Because as much as I want all the library systems to succeed and all do great things, I recognize they serve vastly different populations, and local funding to me is the best way to go about serving a state as geographically large and diverse as Virginia is. And so that was one of the conversations that came out of the small group discussion we had, and why I would further like to see the study. Like I said in the beginning, it may be that I'm a full of air gas bag, and I'm just wishing upon hope for localities to step up to the plate. But by the same token, if by requesting this study and again the study gets done, then maybe that lights a fire under some localities that could be at risk of a change in formula. Hey, no, don't change our formula. We promise we'll spend more. And they prove to us that they spend more, and okay, that's stick before the carrot. I don't care for the horse, whichever way it goes. I would just like to see overall more local funding of our library systems. And if this is another one of the reasons to support this, then so be it.
Well, I wonder if they,
Sandy?
I just wanted to add one little footnote. Keep in mind, the formula is older than 20 years. 20 years was just the last time it was looked at.
Okay.
Through that JLARC study. But the Kim might know the year it was enacted, but it goes back way beyond 20 years, just to keep in mind.
Okay, fair enough. Laura?
Of course, out in my neck of the woods, so to speak, I've got all of the rural area. A lot of that rural area is losing population, and these communities are going to continue to struggle to, as their tax base continues to shrink. It's going to be harder for them to put their own skin in the game, which I want them to put skin in the game. I've been to these libraries. I see that they are being used, but it's tough. And I've got the code up. The most recent, 1990.
Right.
On the code, I think was the last time.
oh, the formula was 1990?
The code 42-1.1-48. Yeah, looks like
That's it.
1990.
Yeah, and while I'm in favor of more local funding, in instances where populations are getting smaller and the tax base is getting smaller, that's where the need for state aid could become greater. And that's my equity bent on state aid. Exactly for that reason. As much as I spent my career advocating for Loudoun County, the smaller communities are the ones where we really need robust library services. Because I've always said it's a chance for people to get away, or it's a chance for people to stay, have a reason to stay. And education and libraries through education is one of those ways.
I'm curious. I mean, I generally support looking at the formula, given it's old, right? And it is based on an entirely different population, entirely different demographics. Virginia has changed so significantly since the last formula was adopted. I think now is a good, and given that JLARC studies are not quick, I think it's a good time to at least start having this conversation or start pushing this conversation. I know we're looking at delayed census numbers, but we are looking at new census numbers, just sort of around the corner. I think too that given the conversation around, especially around COVID and who has access to broadband and internet, I would love to see the library injected into some of those broadband conversations. I was actually just having a conversation with some friends where I said, quite frankly, it does no good to students to all get broadband if there's no resources or support to show them what a good source is, right? So it's deeper than just everyone get broadband so you can do schoolwork at home. There are a lot of infrastructure questions and just school and learning infrastructure questions that I think that libraries could play a really big role in. So I think it's, there's a lot of reasons that I think this timing is really good. I also, though, and knowing that full funding is a moving target because of population changes and just everything, right? It could be a bit of a pie in the sky, but I think the conversation is that for me, it's a both and. We're talking about libraries only getting to 60%. And them being an incredibly valuable resource. And I don't want us to dismiss that push for full funding in the coming years. I get that, no one wants to have a budget conversation right now in the midst of a pandemic, but I think it's incredibly important. And we've seen all these, these equity conversations coming up and who has access to what. In this particular moment, I think it's also a good moment to make sure that all communities have resources. I do actually also, just to add, do agree with Marcy in terms of the sometimes larger populations do have different needs and are looking at certain equity issues a little bit differently. I know that I did work in a large library system, and this was a few years ago now, but one of the most pressing needs was being able to serve a growing refugee community in language. And that was not a cheap or easy proposition. So folks were putting together little grants here and there. So I get that. And I want to make sure that those types of conversations are also embedded in this state aid and JLARC study conversation.
Any other comments or questions for Kim?
I'm just wondering, a JLARC study is a big deal. And are there any other areas of library service, like maybe this whole issue of access to broadband throughout the Virginia, or what's the library's place in online learning? I really am. I just think we should not approach this with any kind of hint that libraries are going to be pitted against each other based on size or land area or whatever. Maybe they're any formula that's 30 years old is probably, I guess in 2001 there weren't any adjustments made to the 1990 formula. Is that what I'm hearing, that it was reviewed in 2001, but no changes were made at that point? Yeah.
And I don't, and to answer your supposition, Marcy, I don't know what can be, I don't know how specific or precise a JLARC needs to be, or how broad-based it can. Andy, do you have any insight into that? Can a JLARC cover a variety of questions?
I think, well, I don't know, but maybe it seems
Sandy?
like we have to be very specific about what we're requesting.
Right.
And if it's to study the formula, that's one thing, but if it's to, I don't know what the other, what
Sandy?
the other thing would be. It's just that it's a big deal to ask for one. So let's ask for the thing that's most important to us.
And there's nothing to stop them from going beyond the parameter of what you ask for. From what I've been reading in the newspaper lately, there are several studies that they are doing right now, and they are very urgent, including, I think they just moved to the top of the pile, one working with the Virginia Employment Commission and workforce issues, because there have been some issues that surfaced during this pandemic, and citizens are upset. So you do have to have a clear rationale when you ask for it. And you have to, the full library board needs to, be on board and vote for that. And then there would need to be a strategy about who to approach to see if they will introduce a request for there to be a study. So there's several steps in the process.
Yeah, I mean, our step today would be, if we get to that point, would be to consider a motion to support asking for a JLARC study, bring that to the full board to get their support to ask for a JLARC study, and then a strategy to go figure out who in the General Assembly would then carry that request, because it's a bill, essentially. You have to approve the ability to go do a JLARC study, and then it has to get assigned, and then it has to be prioritized, and then it has to fit in which is why I said it's likely, Marcy, you're in the first year of your second term. It's the likelihood of this study coming back during your remaining term is low. I mean, but if we don't start asking the question now, by the time we get around to it, this formula will be 40 years old. And Virginia will have either a 12th representative in the House, or may go back down to 10. Who knows where we were going? And to have 40 years in between looking something, and this gives us a chance to try from an advocacy position, from what we can do as board members, to encourage the state to continue to look at public libraries and how we develop public libraries. And if studying the state aid formula is the one thing that we can ask them to do that can get them to think about public library development, then that's, again, the largest reason for rationale for doing this is we need to keep ourselves in front of the General Assembly. We need to keep the libraries up front as best we can, recognizing that there's always something else that's more important than the libraries. Not to diminish Virginia Employment Commission stuff, of course not. But we're always, the itty bitty sliver of leftover money. Yet we serve in any library system in the Commonwealth, the number of people that hold library cards in that jurisdiction is 2 to 3 to 4 times the number of people served by the public school in that jurisdiction. I think in Loudoun County, there's 260,000 library cards issued. There's only 84,000 people in the school system. So it's a big deal that it's the one service that more people use than any other in any jurisdiction. And the more we can get the state to remember that and focus on it and look at it and find ways that might be able to help us improve an equitable distribution of the funding available to the libraries from the state, then that's the larger reason for, and this is the most viable way to encourage the state to do that. And through the course of doing a JLARC, they may find something and they may not. At the end of the day, they may come back and say, Miller, you're crazy. We're doing it right the whole time. It was a waste of our time, but thank you for making us do it. We confirmed what we've known for the last 20, 30 years. Okay. Okay. So I'm governor. That's all we can hope for.
Well, but you say we are looking for a more equitable. I'm not sure that what we've got isn't equitable. That's what.
Fair enough.
I guess I'm not convinced that what we've got now is not equitable. It's based on land area, population. There are caps to keep the local support from getting out of hand for the libraries that have a higher, or the jurisdictions that have a higher ability to pay. So there are checks and balances. It was confirmed in 2001. I would feel better about asking for it if it were based on the idea, for example, that this pandemic has shown us the inequity in computer or broadband access and internet access. Even within jurisdictions, even within Virginia Beach, we have areas of our city that are not as well equipped to do online learning or online resource gathering than in certain other areas. And I'm sure that's true of lots of large cities as well as the rural area. But I would not want to go or present to the General Assembly the impression that there's anybody other than maybe you, Mark, who thinks that the current formula is inequitable, because I'm not sure I don't think that's the case. I think most large and small libraries would say, sure, we'd all like more money, but we don't think that the formula's not fair, other than Fairfax with the population thing. But
are there, out of curiosity, are there other funding formula best practices that, y'all have done the work, obviously? Are there other best practices for places that, no one's fully funding their libraries at this point, but
Good question. I don't
for
have.
places where formulas look better, right? And I think something like that would be incredibly helpful.
Nan, do you have any comment on that?
Well, I will defer to Kim. She's done the research there, and as I understand it, Kim can correct me, most states are doing something very similar to what we are doing. Kim, do you have a different insight?
No, although I think based on what I heard from the state data coordinators recently, our formula is actually a little more robust than a lot of them, a little bit more included in the considerations and the calculations, which tends to make it a bit more equitable. And just over the years, looking at our spreadsheets, it seems to be moving organically towards equity of smaller systems just because of those expenditure caps.
That was going to be my question, but the concern for me is the timing. And if it takes that long, where's the benefit eventually? If you're saying, with Marcy's example, if she's in her second term and this probably won't even come about, she'll be off or whatever, same with me or whatever. So are we leaving anybody behind? And I'm coming back with the point Marcy made, that how do we know it's not equitable? It's been working. Everybody kind of is happy. It's just out of date. And there are changes, like you said, but is anybody losing anything that we know of that gives us the time to get through this whole process? So if we approve to support this, get it to the full board and go forth, couple years, maybe year, maybe 2 years, whatever, is anybody losing anything, any of the libraries? Or like I said, is it still working the way it's supposed to be? And what Kim just said, ours seems to be a little more robust than others. And so if nobody's leaving behind, then that's telling me we have the time over the next, say, 3 to 5 years to get this through, to at least look at it. So that's just a up in the air question. Just not leaving anybody behind. Are we okay? This is going to take a few years or not? Is it going to cost anybody anything more?
I don't know that.
I don't think there's a pressing urgency
Okay.
to it.
Okay.
But it's just.
But it should be looked at.
But
Yes.
right, because if we wait another 5 years before having this conversation again, and then by the time it happens, the formula is now 40 years old, and it just seems to
Right.
be something that's worth looking at. And to Marcy's point, if we formulate the ask in a way that's just saying, hey, this is a 30-year-old formula based on demographics from probably the 1980 census,
Right.
that is this something we should look at to see how we can, if it's necessary, to improve? We did this study 20 years ago, and the state found that it was working fine. And is 20 years enough? Because that was 10 years since it was enacted. It's been twice as long since they looked at it the first time. So maybe it's just say, hey, maybe it's time for us to take a look and see where we are in the redistribution of the population of Virginia as it's grown and consolidated in certain areas and other areas have gotten smaller, is there a reason to look at this to say, maybe we need to take a look to see if there is a even more robust formula?
Or can
Or
we do it better?
Can we do
You
it
know,
better?
Yeah.
The question
yeah,
is, it's not, is it working? Can it be done better?
Better.
And if there is a way to do it better that can help more people, and like I said, maybe even light a fire in the General Assembly to find more money to support it, and if we can tie it to a broadband request, I've often, with John Bowerbank and I used to have these conversations, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good to be able to get on the information superhighway if you can't even get on the Eisenhower superhighway. If you're so far removed from the world that you have access to information and you can't go anywhere and do anything with it.
Right.
So
So far in the reading of the 149 pages and the document, I didn't see where there was anything that triggers for a review, say 10 years later. So if this happens, that might be something that needs to say every 10 years, maybe we need to look at this or something to add to the point because of the changes and the things that Kim mentioned, population, or you mentioned, and things like that. Because this document was dated, what I'm looking at, that report summary was 2001.
Right.
I heard something in the 90s. So that might need, every so many years again to look at it. So that might be another recommendation. And part of that study is to come up with something that's reasonable, because I think we're way past the time of checking because of just the economy and everything that's happened, that we could also make this better and say, well, every 10 years it needs to be looked at. And I'm just throwing that 10-year thing out, because everything else we look at is every 3 years typically is a time frame to review some policy or reporting stuff. So, but no, I think it's good. I don't know if we got to have a motion or whatever to at least take it to the full board, but I think it's a great idea.
I mean, to your point, Shelley, we look at the Public Library of Excellence document every 2 years.
And nothing's changed.
Oh yeah,
so that's triggering something else to say, well, okay, they're not seeing anything.
Right.
We're going to go look at something,
Well, this time we add the equity provision to public library, planning for library excellence. So you're right. It wouldn't be a bad idea to have a trigger in there, because like we said, if the current formula was enacted in 1990, they reviewed it in 2001. Well, that was 11 years. It's been 20. So it could be something that we're asking the state. Look, I wish there was a way to just go to the state without having to do a JLARC study.
And what's the cost? 1990.
Yeah.
I don't even, this could be huge.
Yeah. And the actual cost of doing a study, the state has an office that's what they do.
What, Kim, the formula is kind of floating. I mean, the updated census data is funneled in
automatically.
I mean, we don't have to change the formula every time we have a census or population count.
No.
And of course, the local per capita funding is adjustable every year as part of the formula. I'm just feeling like we've got it. We're almost creating a problem where, I mean, where's the urgency? Where's the concern? I mean, I agree. All libraries need more funding, but asking them to look at JLARC, to look at the state aid formula, doesn't seem like it's addressing the issue where we would like to see, the goal of having all libraries funded better through the state. It just doesn't seem like we're focusing our energies on the right thing.
Then how do we as a board lobby? It doesn't come from Sandy and the staff. So how does it come from us as gubernatorial appointees to lobby the governor, Department of Education, and the General Assembly to further fund library services in the state.
I think through the legislative committee as we've done to try to, increase the, 100% state aid funded, fund the formula. I mean, how many lobbying efforts have we raised to get the General Assembly to fund that formula to 100%?
But it hasn't, to this point, it hasn't worked. And additionally, I would love to also lobby for this Library of Virginia budget to be higher so that we can get to the
Exactly.
130 FTEs, not just 120, much less 170.
Yeah.
Well,
know,
it did work in
have a
2001,
production
Mark.
budget. I'm sorry.
It did work in 2001. We actually did achieve full funding. And then the economy dove. So
Sure.
there went that effort. But for several years now, it's been a gradual and steady increase. Look at the progress we made just this past year. 1 million floated late in
Sure.
November, and then another for this coming fiscal year. Due to the efforts of the VLA Legislative Committee and all of the library community to support the libraries.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a priority focus for everyone, and that is the dedicated conduit for lobbying for those efforts.
And look, at the end of the day, that's when we brought the committee, because if there's not enough support from the committee, there's not enough support. That's just something that I wanted to, tackle. Laura, you had a question?
Yes, kind of shifting the question a little bit. Earlier in the discussion, someone mentioned that the regional library systems, the trend is now to deregionalize. And I'm wondering what is better? Is it better to have a regional system, or is it better to have a less regional system? And is there some connection that could be made between using a funding formula as policy to encourage certain activity like a regional library system, as opposed to everybody going on their own?
You've hit the nail on the head, Laura, and that's really it. It is better financially to be a regional system for a number of reasons, and that is reducing the duplication, triplication of effort. For example, if you regionalize 3 municipalities, you're paying 1 library director, not 3 library directors. There's economy of scale. There's just a wide variety of reasons, economic reasons to regionalize, as well as better service to the public. What we have been seeing happening when libraries have divorced, as we call it, it's been a matter of local control. That they're saying, well, we'd rather control our own library system, how we do business, rather than have to negotiate with this locality and that locality, and they can't agree. And that seems to, so the local control issue seems to be driving that impetus for deregionalization. However, from a best practice point of view, regionalization does provide a more robust, responsive, and economically responsible library model.
Although, we studied it here and it was not economically feasible. When banks merge and consolidate, you can close the BB&T office that's right across the street from the SunTrust office. So you only have 1 bank in that area, but where you used to have 2. And that's not the case for libraries. We build libraries in each jurisdiction. You're not going to close libraries. And it was just too big an operation. I mean, you say, okay, you only have 1 library director, but you'd also have to have somebody in charge of the Virginia Beach
Sure.
areas,
Well,
Norfolk
and I completely agree that for very large systems like Virginia Beach, like Arlington, like it probably doesn't make sense. And those who are really trying to incentivize are these small libraries.
Yeah, right.
You know, when Smith and Bland deregionalized, are they better off for it? I'm not sure that they are. When Mecklenburg and Lunenburg deregionalized, are they better off for it? Not sure that they are.
Yeah.
So, you know,
I
there are
agree.
certainly scale issues that have to be addressed on a case by case basis.
And that's the question that you've got that, and then there's this asking perhaps a relook of the state funding formula. Is there a way of incentivizing regionalization?
Yes.
And
we
of
do.
course,
That is a part of the formula now. You get more state aid if you represent number of jurisdictions.
I think what Laura's asking is there a way to further incentivize through state aid formula so
Oh,
that that the regional systems made up of smaller jurisdictions are less likely to divorce themselves and go to strict local control. Is there a way to, I think Laura's asking, is there a way to incentivize it further so that you're even more less likely, the implication of breaking up, so to speak, is more financially detrimental than it would be to stay together in a regional system. I think that's the question. Is that the question you're kind of asking, Laura?
yes, make a divorce very expensive.
right.
Sure. There are certain amounts already built into the formula, and those could be increased. In reality, when libraries and localities are looking at those factors to regionalize or deregionalize, they're often put off by the fact that the regional incentive is actually not very much money. So sure, if you increase those amounts, then that would definitely weigh in their considerations and have much more impact.
So maybe that's the avenue that, and there could be caps within that so that you discourage having very large library systems regionalize themselves. So that, like Marcy says, you have one library director, but you have to have 4 regional associate directors to go out in the field and be local to those regions, as opposed to some of the regions now, which there are regions that have 3 libraries in them that cover 4 different counties that are geographically large distances. I've always compared Loudoun's geographic size to that of Nelson County, and Nelson County, I think, is part of a regional system. Nelson County has 15,000 people over 450 square miles. That's a spread out place. So having a regional system benefits them, but it is geographically hard for that director to get to all of the branches in one day, much less that week. So yeah, there are certainly challenges even at the regional level with small libraries that you'd find at a regional level if you combine large library systems. But that incentive could be one of the things that we're asking of a JLARC study to look at is there another way could that be the avenue to examine this, to help prevent smaller regional libraries from breaking up?
Nelson is part of a regional there with Jefferson Madison regional system.
Right. Is that Kareem's region? Is that Kareem's library?
That's
No.
David Plunkett.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
That's
aren't
actually
most of
8
these
jurisdictions.
oh, sorry.
All right, go ahead,
Go
Marcy.
ahead.
But aren't most of these breakups a result of personal differences of opinion? I mean, many regional libraries were formed because there were alliances and people made it happen, just like people make divorces happen. I mean, I'm not sure the formula. I'm not sure the formula would be. I mean, I would have a hard time supporting a full JLARC study if, I mean, it just seems like I just don't see the urgency, you know, there are a lot greater needs, I would think. And I could get full on behind a full funding for that library formula. I could get on board with that. And I think it's really needed, but I just am not seeing the urgency of studying the formula.
And I opened this by saying the overall meeting by saying I'd like to ask questions and then have discussion within a motion. Obviously, I'm not doing that this time because I didn't know where the motion would go. I didn't know which motion we'd be considering. So it's helpful to have the discussion in advance. The first item we knew the motion we wanted to have. Here we didn't. Here was just, this is why I wanted the committee to come together so we could have a robust discussion about this. I don't have all the answers. I just had a thought that this was something that could be looked at. If there is general consensus that we don't need to do this now, then there's no reason to have a motion at all. If there is, more from a straw poll of a general notion that this could be something that we'd want the state to look at, through our discussion now, we can do that. And if that's the case, we can make a motion addressing as such. So I'm just kind of straw polling now what everyone tends to think in general. I know where Marcy stands.
I'm kind of going with Marcy. If just because of the time element, as my questions, and if it's working and we're not leaving anybody behind and there's some sort of equity that's going on, maybe it's not the time. But then again, in the back of me, 20 years and they haven't looked at this, also tugs at you. But if it's working, yeah.
Maya?
I'm sort of mixed. Honestly, I'm not opposed to requesting and working with our legislators on a JLARC. But I think there has to be a probably long discussion with some pretty great deal of specificity on what we're asking and and that was one of the reasons I asked for if there were some other best practices out there, because I think it's really important to be very clear on how we believe that this thing is inequitable, other than it's old. And look, because, and I mentioned the demographic changes, and the demographic changes alone are one reason to take a look at this. But I think we all need to come with some real ideas on how this thing could change or be or currently be inequitable, how it could become more equitable. I think just it's an old formula is not quite there. I wouldn't be opposed to a motion, but it would have to come with some level of, but first we're going to dig in to a bigger discussion.
Laura?
Studies for study's sake that end up on a shelf tend to, I don't tend to like those. I keep thinking about the state's funding formula for schools. I think that rural schools do pretty well with it, and they're always afraid that it's going to be tweaked against them. But at the same time, there's this part of me that says, I get do no harm, but at the same time, what's the harm in asking to see if there are things that could be tweaked that help out everybody, and maybe make it easier to keep the regional libraries intact or encourage the development. And then ensuring that the libraries who have greater diversity are properly served so that they can hit those marks in the new, and I'm sorry, it's called the Planning for Library Excellence plan. So I'm torn. I'm torn.
Okay. Based on the straw poll, I think what I've heard is if we're going to do this, we would need even more robust discussion we've had today. This will be the first in a conversation, a future of conversations, and also to bring around even more specificity, not saying more specificity, but a more focused ask of the General Assembly for the JLARC study that focuses on the areas that we believe are most in need, which could be regional libraries, it could be broadband access, and not just looking at the state aid formula. That could be part of it. It could be a multi-pronged approach. And perhaps with Sandy's blessing, we could ask Nan and Kim to put their heads together and look at some other best practices and see, just because we might be the best now, that's like saying I'm the best basketball player on a court. I might be, but it doesn't mean that LeBron James and Kevin Durant aren't on another court that we could learn from. And so, and perhaps with the grace of God and vaccinations, we'll be in person in September. I really hope so. At that point, if you haven't gotten a vaccine, it's your own choice and you can stay home. But perhaps we can do a couple things. One, ask Nan and Kim to look at some best practices of other states. We can bring this conversation or summary of the conversation to the full board in June to let them know the things we've been looking at, and then plan to have a further discussion at the September meeting where we might be able to see if we're further along or more people come around or are dissuaded, and we leave it there, or we can continue to go forward to some sort of a JLARC ask of the General Assembly at that point. And that's where I seem to think the consensus of the board of the committee would be right now. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I'm not sure. I think we have to make sure we're not, having the solution be in search of a problem. I think we need to first of all determine where we have a problem, if we have a problem. I mean, that would include getting input from all the libraries across Virginia about their assessment of the formula. I mean, they might, if with full funding, even that regional component of the formula may be sufficient incentive for people to not get divorces or form more regional library systems. So I think we're in danger of picking off a little piece and saying, okay, we need a full-blown study because we think there might be some inequities. I just don't see the inequities, and I don't see the issue. I mean, let's what are the major problems of libraries throughout the Virginia, and if they have any relevance even to the formula itself. I just I think I like your idea of looking at what other states are doing, what might be best practices. Maybe there are some other ways to look at this. I think it just is going to take a lot more discussion just to say identify what the problem is. And then maybe a JLARC study is the solution to what the problem is, but I haven't heard exactly what the problem is yet.
Okay, and that's what I was saying. We can ask Kim and Nan to continue to gather that information, and poll the 90 odd library directors, and we can group them in size of library, whether regional or not. And like I said, Nan and I had a small group discussion with 6 of them, I believe. But maybe perhaps Nan and I convene groups of 8 or 10 and get to all of them by the end of the summer, and kind of survey and poll in that regard and find some information from them, while we again brief the full board on our discussion today. And hopefully in September we can have another robust discussion about where we are and further information we've gathered, and then make a decision at that time. Do we proceed, or do we gather more information, or does leaking our conversations to members of the General Assembly spur them on to say, ooh, maybe we should just go ahead and fund the state aid, which is my ultimate goal. My ultimate rationale for this was an interim bridge for getting smaller libraries the resources they need until such a time that the state has done what they said they were going to do. And perhaps between now and in September, we as individual board members can come to figure out some way to figure out how to better lobby our state representatives to do what the state code says they should be doing, which is writing a check to state aid for $27 million a year.
And that's really the legislative committee's, emphasis.
Andy?
But this committee could put that forward in reporting on this and say, we hope that next year's Legislative and Finance Committee will consider endorsing, supporting. What usually happens is the library community secures a budget amendment. And that usually proposes anywhere from, $500,000 to $2 million, because they do it in increments.
Right.
Additional for state aid. So this committee could say, we hope that next year the Legislative and Finance Committee will consider supporting that with a letter, with an advocacy effort. Because I think if you were to ask most library directors right now what the key problem is, they would say state aid formula is not fully funded.
Right.
So that is something that would make a difference for everyone. So and it sounds like there's widespread agreement on this committee that would be an important thing
I
to
think
push.
that's
And let me
good.
tell you, it's not just state aid that I'm after. Sandy needs at least $1 million a year for a collection budget. At least $1 million a year for a collection budget. And we need, we need a ton more people. With just so much more work to be done in the library system. We're $10 million short overall. I'll take $4 million state aid, $2 million for staffing, and $2 million for collection budget tomorrow, and we'd be thrilled, and we'd still be grossly underfunded.
I think there's a huge opportunity to lobby for this, right? I think libraries poll at 80+% approval ratings, even amongst people who don't use them. And so I think there's some opportunities to really dig in to a coordinated lobbying effort on the part of the board.
Yeah. And I think also piggybacking on the experience of the public schools and online education, and why public libraries are so important in this day of online access to information and resources. So we have a great time to focus our energies on, how can we be most effective in meeting these needs?
Okay. So that's what we'll do. There's no motion on the table to address, and I'll brief the full board as such in June. And then I'll get with Nan and Kim and work on a pathway to collecting the necessary information and meeting with the necessary people to gather the information to bring back to this committee in person, I hope, in September. In order to keep us further on track, we have one more agenda item, just a quick update, I guess from Nan on
Cares.
the CARES Act and then the American, what was it, American
Rescue plan.
Rescue Plan? Okay, that's what it was.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I will be quite brief. The CARES Act funding was distributed to 20 libraries that met the dubious qualifications of having high poverty, high unemployment, and low broadband connectivity. And those libraries had to meet a number of requirements about how they spent their money for reimbursement. And they have ranged anywhere from buying a new outreach vehicle to purchasing Chromebooks and hotspots to installing after hours pickup lockers, anything you can imagine that aided library usage during the pandemic, particularly providing broadband, has occurred. And a lot of the libraries are well on their way to expending those funds, which the deadline of which is September 30. There are a couple that are encountering some supply chain problems. You have been hearing about that in the news, and that is a very real thing. So we actually, Sandy and others and I met with IMLS this morning and to let them know we'd be having to file some extensions just due to the fact that people can't get supplies. They can't get what they ordered. So that's going to be a challenge. The ARPA funds, Virginia was allocated $3.8 million. We are still in the planning stages of how we'll distribute that money. About 1.4 will be used to benefit statewide programs that encompass not only Find It Virginia assets, workplace development assets, and school readiness things, but also a distribution to all localities without qualification of those poverty, broadband, and unemployment issues. That project is going to be a real stretch, not only for the libraries that receive that large sum of money. It's hard to spend that much money fast and responsibly. And it will certainly be a heavy lift for the Library of Virginia. The CARES funds was a nice little guinea pig pilot of doing subgrants, and we learned a lot. And, I think that we'll be able to do it, but we will certainly be on our toes to not only support the libraries, monitor the libraries, but get all of our federal I's dotted and T's crossed. So that's still in development. We're working on it. We hope to have monies out to libraries just as quickly as we can, but we've got to make sure that we have all of the documentation in order before we give them not only the greenbacks, but the green light. So we're working diligently.
Nan, how much was the ARPA money?
$3.8 million.
2.8 million, okay.
Mhm.
Okay. And that's hard to spend. And so
It is. And, part of the difficulty is, it's not like you can just say, oh, we'll buy a bunch of databases, because then that's they have to expire by September 30, 2022. So it's, you give somebody something and then you take it away. So
Okay.
it's just not as simple as you might think.
It's really for one-time use or
Right.
a single expenditure. The item
Right.
might be around for a while, but you have to spend it.
Yes. And so
Right.
subscription-based platforms are not the answer.
Fair enough.
So we'll see.
Could you be able to provide for us a list of the 20 jurisdictions that quote unquote won?
Yes, I can
Say
do
quote
that.
unquote because it's a dubious
Right. Right.
distinction to be considered in that category. But
Yes.
we're 20 jurisdictions that fit into that category, and that could be something that the legislative committee could take up when they go lobby the state.
Sure.
By the way, look, here's
Mhm.
20 jurisdictions that fit this category. I can assure you, those same 20 jurisdictions would fit plenty of other categories that are out there that you should address.
Indeed. I'll be happy to email that list to you, Mark, and then you can distribute to the committee as you see fit.
Terrific.
Mhm.
Okay. The report of the committee chair has happened. And if there are any other questions or comments from the group,
Well,
seeing,
thanks for getting us together. This was great.
Yeah.
thank you for the robust discussion. It's something that I've
Yeah.
wanted to do all year. It's just the opportunity never presented itself since we haven't seen each other in person since January of last year.
I think
So we're
so.
going on 16 months,
Mhm.
hopefully by September. Hopefully. If weather's nice, if we just do it outside, Nancy, that in the courtyard somewhere, we can just meet outside. So, okay,
If we had to do it as a hybrid, you know, with some people in person and some not, I think that's where we'd like to be.
gotcha. Well, count me in for coming to Richmond. I'm happy to be there. So I'm got both my shots and got sick both times, and
Oh,
I've had COVID, so I'm covered 1,000 ways to Sunday. So I'm happy to come down and visit with folks. All right, everybody. Thank you very
Thanks.
much. And to the
Thank
YouTube
you.
crowd who was watching, we are now adjourned.
Thank you,
Be
Mark.
well.
Thank
Nan, I'll
you.
be in touch.
Everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
And Mark?
Yeah.
That lady's name was Rebecca. I mean, Robin.
Robin, your last
Robin
name?
Reeves.
Robin
Burke.
Reeves. I'll see if I
Robin,
can-
she's vice president.
I'll find out.
Thanks.
Thank
Last name
you.
is Burke. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.